You ever get the feeling that there's like people watching you? I've heard the term peanut gallery used, but I can tell you what, I am just beside myself with joy at the music and the sounds that fill this space, be it children's laughter or the songs that are sung. It is wonderful. Absolutely wonderful. We continue with the story of Jacob in the 32nd chapter of the book of Genesis. He is returning back to the land of his birth. He has divided his family, and now we come up with the 22nd verse. That same night he got up and took his 2 wives, 2 maids, and his 11 children and crossed the ford of Jabbok. He took them and sent them across the stream, and likewise everything he had. Jacob was left alone, and a man wrestled with him until daybreak. When the man saw that he did not prevail against Jacob, he struck him on the hip. Jacob's hip was put out of joint as he wrestled with him. Then he said, "Let me go, for the day is breaking." But Jacob said, "I will not let you go unless you bless me." So he said to Jacob, "What is your name?" And he said, "Jacob." Then the man said, "You shall no longer be called Jacob, but Israel, for you have striven with God and with humans and have prevailed." Then Jacob asked him, "Please tell me your name." But he said, "Why is it that you ask my name?" And there he blessed him. So Jacob called the place Peniel, saying, "For I have seen God face to face, and yet my life is preserved." May God continue to bless the experiences of Scripture on this day. May the Spirit descend and guide the meditations of our hearts and the words of my lips. So we're in a worship series that deals with relationships. We started off talking about creation and God's desire for relationship with us. And the thread I want to pull on is that thread of the God-us relationship. And then last week, we heard about Sarah and Abraham. And we got a little window into the challenges of relationship with each other. Sometimes it can be hard. Sometimes it's funny, and sometimes not so funny when we relate to each other. I want to pull on that thread because this week we are dealing with probably the most challenging relationship we can have, and that is the relationship we have with ourselves. We might not often think about the relationship we have with ourselves, the lens through which we experience the world, but if I'm to be honest, I will say that the easiest person for me to lie to is me. I do it a lot. I come up with all kinds of rationales and reasons for the way that I do things or don't do things, for the words that I say, the silences that I keep, for the fact that my microphone has just gone out. Batteries, right? It's all their fault. Or a bear, one or the other. So I come up with all kinds of reasons why I do the things I do. Some of them are actually fairly accurate reflections. Use the handheld. Some of them are fairly accurate reflections. This means I can't talk with my hands. You realize this is going to shorten the sermon greatly. Clapping, thank you. 2 microphones, huh? Is there a game on today? But the stories I tell myself to justify what I do, these sorts of things become part of my narrative, right? And so some of them, I'm perfectly aware of what I'm doing, and they're fairly honest and accurate, and some of them are a little more flexible in their accuracy and their reflection of who I am, and I have to deal with those. I have to wrestle them with my past, the story that I tell about myself, if I am to be as whole of a human being as I can be. Now, this story of Jacob has often been told as Jacob wrestling with God. Scripture even talks about Jacob either wrestling an angel or wrestling with God. We have beautiful artwork that deals with those things. But I want us to go down the path of Jacob actually wrestling his past. For Jacob had a past. He had a history just like the rest of us. He was born grasping at things that weren't his to have. That's how he got his name, because he was hanging on to his brother's heel, we are told in Scripture. And we know that throughout his life, he would take advantage of the situation so that he can get things that weren't technically his to have. And God would constantly be working through this. He took advantage of his brother and his father in their moments of weakness to get a birthright and a blessing out of them. It's amazing the things that we will commit to in a moment of weakness without fully understanding. Congregational president. Moment of weakness. Jacob takes advantage of these things. He is shrewd in the way that he handles them, but it becomes part of his narrative, his story about himself that he either wants to acknowledge or wants to get away from, and that becomes part of Jacob's history as well. Even though he was born wrestling his brother, much of his story in Scripture is of someone who is fleeing a situation. He flees the land he was born in, and eventually he has to flee his uncle or another member of family to come back home again when he is called. And there's something else in Jacob's story, his narrative, his past that he tells, and that is, I'm almost never alone. When you're born with the sibling so close to you, when you're in a larger family like that, you might feel alone, but he was never really by himself, except for when he had the vision of the angels ascending and descending, and this moment here. Those are the two that really get lifted up in Scripture of Jacob being alone. And even in this moment, he's not by himself, is he? He's wrestling with something, be it God, be it angel, be it his own past. He is wrestling through the night as he is preparing to cross the river to return. And he is afraid of what he has done and the choices that he has made. He is afraid of the way his brother's going to react. Fear will cause us to do a lot of things. Fear is a powerful motivator. That's why I think it's so good that God chooses to love us into relationship than scare us into one personally. So Jacob wrestles through the night. Nighttime in Scripture is when a lot of things take place. Usually nefarious activities happen at night. Things that we don't want other people knowing about. Criminal activities or the embarrassing questions like when we go to Jesus and say, what does it mean to be born again? Nighttime is a time also of transformation. It is the moment when the caterpillar is in the cocoon or the chrysalis and going through a very traumatic change. A molecular level transformation taking place. Jacob wrestles through the night. He is wrestling with all that was so that he can be as whole as possible to go into what will be. For some of us, that's a lot of wrestling. We spend our lifetime handling small moments like that, trying to come to terms with the stories we have said about ourselves, with the things that we have done or left undone. Sometimes we go through it all at once in one fell swoop and are transformed, and sometimes we just nip at the edges. Small bites, right? That's how you eat the elephant. And a new day is coming. A dawning of sorts, a hatching of the butterfly. I'm to use that imagery even more. And as that day is coming, it is clear that the things that were need to come to an end. This final bit of wrestling for Jacob in this moment has to cease so that he can move forward. Now, the individual he's wrestling with, again, be it God, angel, or himself, says, "You've got to let me go so that you can go forward. Your narrative that you have been telling will not go away. The history is not going to be erased, but it cannot control you any longer if you are going to be fruitful in this next stage of your life." And Jacob does eventually let go. What if we were to follow this text and this line of thought that I'm going down, then we have to realize also that Jacob is not unscathed. He is not without the markers of wrestling himself down. It is hard work coming to terms with who we are, trying to define ourselves, what we are and what we are not. It is hard work for individuals, it is hard work for communities, and a lot of times it's easier just to tell our story, our narrative, and say, well, this is it, this is all it's ever going to be, so we just sort of keep reliving it over and over again. Jacob comes out limping. We're told his hip has been dislocated. But he also comes out transformed. For we are also told that he is no longer Jacob. Name changes in Scripture are pretty important. They mark that moment of transformation. We see it in several places. Either the outside world views you differently, or your inside has been transformed and renewed, or perhaps it's both when it takes place. We have moments like that in the life of the church. We may not necessarily change our name all the time, but there are transformative moments, baptism, where we take on the name of Christ. We come out of the water, or we come through our confirmation process when we come to own our infant baptism, and we are transformed. Maybe even a little hobbled physically. And that is how Jacob is to go forward as Israel. His past choices, nefarious, underhanded, whatever shameful we want to call, have been redeemed. Not replaced, but redeemed. And he is to go forward as a blessing. And if we choose to go down that same path of wrestling ourselves down on a day like today, we have to be honest with who we are. We have to be honest with where we have come from. And sometimes we have to wrestle, to come to terms with, so that we might too receive a blessing of some kind. Maybe it's a small wrestling match. Maybe it's a large one that has taken us through the night and we are not walking with such ease on this morning, but we go through it because we have been blessed. It is a new day. We are a new people. Thanks be to God. Amen.